Shalom, I'm Dr. Dina Dye with Foundations in Torah, and we are currently going through a series of programs called Days of the Bones. And finally, in the last section, I got to the whole climax of this entire series, talking about the bones. Because in Judges chapter 19, in the story of the Levite and the concubine, when he carries her back on his donkey to his home, he basically cuts her up by her bones, into 12 bones, which he's going to send on to the tribe. So the key, the bones, as I mentioned, I just want to kind of recap from last week, is that the bones are the framing and the beams for the construction of the tabernacle, the house. We talked about what did Adam say about Eve, Isha, his wife. She's bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This is classic language of the construction of the tabernacle. And so we're describing the tabernacle with these beams and with these framing and in terms of bones. We mentioned last time about the importance and the significance of Moses taking Joseph's bones back to the land. It's a promise that was made, and so that's what he did. And because the bones were going to build the house, they were going to be the framework of the house. So the foundation of the house in the ancient world was generally a stone or of some sort, or some sort of brick in ancient Mesopotamia. We describe our temples being built on a rock. The foundation stone, the first temple and the second temple on Mount Moriah in Jerusalem. But obviously, any of you built a house, you got to have a foundation to build the house. Now, the New Testament tells us that Yeshua is the chief cornerstone, and that the foundation is built upon the prophets and the various ministries that we have that are listed in the New Testament, or the Brit Hadashah. So this idea of the bones represents the feminine. And I quoted for you a scripture last week from Exodus 26 and verse 17. It's talking about the supports being connected one to another. And in there it says that they're joined one to another. And the actual Hebrew says that she is joined to her sister, which is very random. But that's because the house represented the woman, and the woman was the bone of Adam's bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. And so over the tabernacle, once you built everything and had the framing structure, there were layers of skins that represented the flesh that was over the tabernacle. Now, of course, Yeshua said the same thing about himself. He said, destroy this temple, in 3 days I will rebuild it, and he will rebuild it with the bones, the etzim. And bones and etzim trees are one and the same. In the ancient world, the king was a tree. That was a metaphor for the king. And so the king, as a tree, the tree would grow and get bigger and bigger and would fill the whole world. And it was talking about his empire. And you can read about that in King Nebuchadnezzar. So, but back to our story and the concept of the bones, and hopefully I would suggest going back and listening to last week's program if this isn't making a whole lot of sense here. But the bones are key to build the house. That's the reason the bones were taken back to the land, because that's where the house was going to be built. Now, we look at her, again, she was cut up into 12 bones, and this was kind of a covenant thing. We talked also last week about in a covenant, when you're establishing a covenant in the doorway, an animal was slit, and the blood there, the two would pass between the blood and secure the covenant. So when a covenant meant to separate or to cut, but also had within it the idea of joining together, the Brit. And so when two were joined together, they represented the animal when it was alive. And so here the animal's dead, but it's almost kind of like a resurrection, really. But think about a human body for a minute, and the tabernacle has been compared to a human body. Now, the rabbis say that there are 613 parts to the tabernacle. Of course, there are 613 Torah commandments. And they say there's 613 parts to the human body. And I can't verify that because I never counted. And I know there's a bit of a discrepancy. But to them, those things are all one and the same. So the living Torah and the tabernacle and the body were one and the same, and so they connect all that. Whether it's exactly right, I don't know. But the idea of a body representing the tabernacle, and remember it talks about David raised, or the fallen tabernacle being raised up, which is exactly the language of Messiah, being raised up, the bones, and the resurrection, which we're gonna. I know you're already ahead of me with the scripture, but I'm just trying to lay some foundation there. So, if we think about a human body, and if you're cutting up the bones or the 12 parts, you would likely have a head and the neck and the chest and the trunk of the body. And we have 2 arms, of course, 2 legs, 2 hands, 2 feet, which would give us a total of 12. And so you have, when you think about a body, the counterfeit of that would, of course, be a statue. And I've talked about before that the kings, the king was the god's idol or statue or image that he would put in the house. Of course, the king was alive, but the king would have a statue made of himself to represent the body. So it's interesting, all of this kind of body language in it. So the Levite cuts the concubine into 12 bones and sends it each part to the tribe. I don't know which part went to which tribe, but I think they got the message. And so because this is a metaphor, a midrashic story, and very graphic in nature, it was probably pretty shocking, to write this. And so the hearers of this would sit up and take notice. Oh my goodness. We have an example of this, only not concerning an actual human body, but an ox. And it tells us that King Shaul, or King Saul, cut an ox and distributed the pieces throughout Israel as a call to war. And we can find that in 1 Samuel 11:17. So that's kind of interesting. Was there some kind of call to war in this act? The Levite had suffered a great affront when it happened, and by the Benjamites, as they raped and abused his concubine. And so the question is, what will the response be? What will Israel do in response to what happened? And then sending out, he is acting in a way that King, now obviously this is earlier. Now we don't really know when it was written, and it could have been put together later in the timing after King Saul. But anyways, this kind of matches that. And so retribution must come, and so what will that retribution be? And how will that all be fulfilled? So all that to say that Israel, the Levite had suffered a tremendous affront. And so, again, retribution had to be wrought. And so by sending these parts, he was making that statement to the rest of Israel. What are you going to do about this? How are you going to avenge what has happened to me? And again, all of this in the context of Israel. This is an interesting quote. I think I got this from the Mishnah, and it says, whoever was unable to get satisfaction for an injury he had received would cut up an ox into pieces and send it around. Now that sounds exactly like what we read about King Saul, what he did. And it says, those who would help obtain a redress of grievances took a piece of the ox. So I guess you could reject it, but if you took, then you were there to assist to get the retribution that you needed to get. So in a sense, the Levite had made the declaration to the entire community, the entire nation, all the tribes, about this crime, and this crime was placed before them. Of course, they had to make a decision about what they were going to do about it. And so it was that the Levite had summoned the entire nation to deal with it. And of course, the response by the nation was that they would stand by him and do whatever was necessary. And now we end up going to war. It's kind of a big deal. As I mentioned, I don't want to repeat myself too much, but again, just going back to the concept of the bones, and then representing the house and the house of Israel and the building of the house and the beams of the tabernacle and the trees from the same word, seam and bones, etc., should immediately, if I know practically everyone knows the scripture then in Ezekiel 37. Can these bones live? This is what this is talking about. There's certainly an element of resurrection in it, but in more so it is about the restoration of the whole house of Israel. And it talks about in Ezekiel 37, I will make breath enter into you and you will live. What's very interesting about that should remind you of Adam, because remember, he came out of the dust of the earth. He was formed from the dust of the earth, and the breath of life was blown into him to make him live as the context of the house. In fact, in the ancient world, one of the names of Pharaoh was the heir of all noses was his name, and because as Pharaoh, he was the incarnation of his God, and he would blow breath into the nostrils of those that he would anoint underneath him. So this idea of the breath entering in and making him live. So the king was said to be the idol or the image of the God placed into the house. And so now we have this idea again then of the king being a life-giving king. And in the ancient world, the king is basically became the idols that they worshiped. Ezekiel 37 goes on to say, I will attach ligaments to you and make flesh grow on you, just like our description that we have of the tabernacle, and cover you with skin and put breath in you. So if you have a building and a tabernacle, as we have built here, how does it have life? How does it have breath? We call it sometimes the Shekhinah, or the life-giving Ruach. And that is essentially the indwelling presence of God. So if the tabernacle looks like a body, and there's life and breath in it, it means that God himself has entered into that tabernacle. And he is the one that has raised it up. And so we see the same pattern with Messiah. It is as though we have a Messiah. He represents a body. It is that life to raise him up. The very life of God has come into him, the Shekhinah, and raised him up with the breath of life to be a tabernacle that's been raised up. And so our body Messiah is God's supposed to be in our midst, functioning in much the same way, the breath of life, raising up our tabernacle. So you have a building, you don't want it to be empty. And so this breath that comes in, the breath that's poured in, this is actually God himself, represented by what later Jews in the later rabbinic tradition was called the Shekhinah, we call it the Shekinah, but that sense of the glory and the indwelling presence of God. And it goes on to say, you will live and you will know that I am Adonai. So that's a very intimate relationship. Again, everything in the context of the house and marriage. So then what does it say? It says, each bone in place stood on their feet. And what do we have? Now we have this huge army. So the pattern and picture is that the slicing up into the pieces and sending the pieces out was a call to battle. And so now there's this huge army that's been raised up. Now, why do we need an army? Because it is this army that finally together as one is going to defeat the enemies of God, the king. Those enemies are the hostile empires that surround Jerusalem, the hostile empires that continually take over Israel as they go into exile and out. Those hostile empires that want their king set up on the throne to replace God himself as being king. And so these bones, it tells us in Ezekiel, is the whole house of Israel. And so that's exactly who this concubine represents. Now, in my opinion, when she put her hand on the threshold, she was making that covenant agreement. And so Israel, in spite of everything, through the representation of this concubine, as strictly as a metaphor, was making a statement that these bones are the whole house of Israel, and she is making that covenant, renewing that covenant with God once again. So this is all very, this language of the bones and the restoration, and I would again suggest going back and rereading Ezekiel and rereading it in this context, because you'll see the king in imagery both before and after. So this concept of the valley of the dry bones has everything to do with the raising up of Israel to become a great army, to defeat the enemies of God. God uses, it's not like he just goes zappo and all the enemies are gone. He uses his people to finally fight the battle, and not to go when he says to go, and to defeat completely. Now remember, in the book of Judges, they didn't do that. They kind of sort of took over various areas. They still had the enemy in there. The enemy was still the thorn in their flesh and prevented them from achieving the land. But this is saying, that's it. The land, the entire land is yours. You are my army. And once you have defeated all the enemies, the king will rule and reign, and the house can be built and dedicated, and God can rule from that place. I'm going to read a passage here then from that chapter, and I want to draw your attention to, we have, instead of etzim is the plural word for bones or trees. The root etz is usually is a tree. And it's interesting as we go through this passage that there are 7 times that the word etz is used. Now, I can't go back over the entire teaching, but in my last series in the beginning, I explained all about the 7. So I'm encouraging you to go back and listen to, it was one of the last programs that I did in that series. And so it says, take one stick. So let's kind of reread it, because a stick, you're like, okay, there's this little stick. Well, we're talking about a tree. It says an etz, it's a tree. Take one tree and write on it for Yehuda, Judah, and those joined with him among the people of Israel. Take another tree and write on it for Joseph. Now you understand why it's so important for Joseph to come back to the land, his bones. The tree of Ephraim and all the house of Israel are joined with him. Bring them together into a single tree. Trees and kings are basically synonymous terms. The kings in the ancient world were called trees because they would grow up and these trees would get large and their empires would cover the entire earth. So the representative of the tree in the ancient world was the king. And so bring them together in a single tree. Adonai Elohim says, I will take the tree of Joseph, Yosef, or the bones, which is in the hand of Ephraim, together with the tribes of Israel who are joined with him, and put them together with the tree of Yehuda, and make them into a single tree. And we've got 7 times we're using the word tree. So that they become one in my hand. I will make them one nation in the land, on the mountains of Israel, and one king will be king for all of them. Do you see this pattern then of the king, of the restoration of the house, in order for the king to sit and rule and reign from that house? A mountain is another idiom for the house. And so all of this is that language that has to do with the rebuilding of the house of God through the bones, the trees of Yehuda, and through Ephraim to become one king. And one king will be the king for all of them. Of course, in the natural, coming out of the line of David and ultimately down to Yeshua the Messiah. So that is really, this is a backdrop for this entire story. I bet you could not imagine that this much information could come out of the story of the Levite and the concubine. And again, if we go back, we look at the culture, the context, the language, and the symbology, and all the different metaphors, it's going to take us to many places in the Bible. So again, we have this concept of the two trees. I mean, think about the garden. How many trees were there? There were two trees, and they would become one tree that would grow to the whole earth, cover the entire earth, and be the one kingdom. And on that day, God will be one, and his name will be one, and he will be king over all. And so all of this process has to play out. Now that brings me to something very interesting, because in Israel, May 14th, 1948 is basically Independence Day, when Israel fought all those enemies, all those Arab enemies, and she defeated, with hardly any, defeated these vast armies of Arabs, and finally gained her independence, declared her independence on that date. It was though her exile was over. The dry bones had become flesh, had become an army, and it defeated those enemies. The same pattern and picture. In Hebrew, the day of independence is called Yom Ha'atzmaut, which atzmi means my bones. It essentially means the day of my bones. Independence Day, when the nation of Israel was established, and back in 48. I think that's not insignificant, because they understood this. It's just we don't. So hopefully in this context, you will see the significance of the Day of Independence, and perhaps you'll celebrate it in a different way if you understand it's the day of my bones, when the bones are all, they come together and they build the house, and in this case, the nation of Israel. And it goes on to say they will no longer be contaminated with their idols. So those idols are the kings of those hostile empires, those Gentile pagan empires, like the Assyrians and the Babylonians, etc. And with their abhorrent things and with all their sins, I will save them, I will deliver them, like what the judges are doing, from all their dwelling places in which they had sinned, and I will purify them. They will follow my ordinances and keep my decrees and fulfill them, speaking of the Torah commandments. It will be an eternal covenant. So here's our covenant language again. And I will place my sanctuary among them forever. I will put my name, I will put my Shekinah, I will put my indwelling presence in the midst of them forever. And this is speaking, of course, at the time when the heavens and the earth are restored, that particular covenant, when God is in the midst of, but remember, God himself, his indwelling presence, came into the sanctuary, and it came into the Messiah himself and raised him up so that he would be the sukkah that was fallen, raised up. All of this language cannot be understood unless we go back and see how Israel functioned. I'll end this particular session on, without going into too much detail, there's a special prayer. It's called the prayer for unity, which certainly we need. Certainly pray this prayer for the unity of the body of Messiah, because we are in some ways clueless of what, and this restoration needs to happen if we are going to make any kind of impact on the world, which clearly we are not, because we've fallen into it's not a walk of suffering and humility and laying ourselves down, but a walk in which we're just bent on enjoying our creature comforts. So we don't really look a whole lot different than anyone else, except for, let's talk about the Christians in the Middle East today. It is our duty is the name of the prayer. It's called the Elenu. And the whole point of this prayer is to remove detestable idolatry. And that is the idolatry that the kings of the nations represent. And you can read about this, I'm not going to read it now, but from Philippians 2:10 and in Isaiah 45:23, both say that every knee will bow. In heaven and on earth and under the earth, you see our three spheres of the cosmic temple. And every tongue will acknowledge that God is King, Yeshua is Lord, however you want to put it, but that is the prayer. This particular prayer was sung, it takes us back to a major persecution of the Jews in a place called Blois, France. This is in 1171. And this is what they chanted. There was a great massacre. The Jews were accused of murdering a Christian child at Passover and Lord knows what else. But many of the masters of the Torah at that time in France were martyred, they were massacred. And as they were murdered, this particular prayer, the Eleni, was sung in this melodious chant. And it was accompanied by these sounds that were almost otherworldly. But it is a prayer that is associated with martyrdom, the Eleni, but it has everything to do with being delivered from that idolatry that we were just talking about. To remove the detestable idolatry from the earth is related to this. It is also a prayer, a song that concludes the prayer services in the Siddur. So in the morning, for instance, as you're concluding this, you will read the Elena. It's actually recited quite a few times a day, but it is that to remove detestable idolatry, and is associated with, often associated with martyrdom. So let me just read this. It says, when the flames blazed and licked the bodies of the victims, they raised their voices in a unison melody. At first, it was a low chant, and afterwards, a high-sounding melody. People asked, which of your songs is this? We've never heard such a melody from before, yet we know very well, for it was the chant of the Eleni. So those of you who may be familiar with the Siddur, you understand this, and you can't help but read it and think Philippians for sure. So next week, we're going to be moving into the whole war thing. We'll just try to close it up here. So we're moving out of Judges 19 into Judges 20. And we find that all of the people of Israel are going to come out, and the entire community is going to assemble at a place called Mitzpah. And this was a place, at one they drew lots, and it took a tithe of the men to collect the food that was going to be needed. However, the tribe of Benjamin refused to hand over the ones who were responsible for the crime against the Levite. And so they would be executed for that crime, but the Benjamites protected those. So part of what takes place in here is the army of Israel from the other tribes are going to go to Beitel. We talked quite a bit about Beitel in the first programs. And it was at Beitel that God gave the order to attack. And it was that Judah, the tribe of Yehudah, went first, typically. In that regard, the tribe went first to attack. And in the first day, the Benjamites slaughtered the tribe of Judah. In fact, it tells us that 22,000 fell on that day. And well, I'm not going to get any further with this. We'll just sort of introduce this idea of the war. We'll pick it up next time. But 22,000 is kind of a significant number. You may remember Gideon's army started out at how many? 22,000. And then that army was cut down to 300. So that's interesting as well. 22, the same as the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. There are 22 letters, but I digress. So thanks for joining me. I'll see you next time. Shalom.